It seems pretty much unthinkable in 2025, and even the past decade, that Russia was once considering and evaluating whether it would want to join the NATO alliance. After all, one of the reasons NATO was founded in the first place was to counter the Soviets and the threat that Russia posed. But yes, once upon a time, or actually a few times, joining the NATO military alliance was something that Russian leaders were considering. Even stranger is that the most recent discussion came from a much younger Vladimir Putin. It was during the man's very first term as president of the Russian Federation. I know this YouTube channel's main theme is Lithuania, and so this topic somewhat strays away from what most videos are about. But I found this historical fact so interesting that I really want to talk about it anyways. After all, Lithuania's national security rests heavily on the fact that it's a member of the NATO alliance. So after the introduction, let's go back in time and look at how and why Russia was thinking about joining NATO. Let's start off with a quote from the very mouth of Vladimir Putin. Apparently, these words came in the year 2000. Russia is part of European culture, and I cannot imagine my own country in isolation from Europe and what we often call the civilized world. So it is hard for me to visualize NATO as an enemy. Wow, how things have changed. That same year, according to then NATO chief George Robertson, Putin bluntly asked, "When are you going to invite us to join NATO?" The Russian president was then informed that he would need to apply to join NATO and not expect an invitation. So like I mentioned at the start, Russia had actually considered joining NATO more than once. The earliest consideration was actually way back in the 1950s, when the Russian Federation was still the Soviet Union. There was a proposal from one Vyacheslav Molotov while he was the Soviet Union's Minister of Foreign Affairs. From my understanding of the material, it sounds like the idea to join was all part of a larger political game aimed at reducing American influence in Europe. The USSR argued that the character of the alliance could be changed easily, and all that had to be done was to be accepted as a member, especially after considering the Soviets' principal role in the recent World War II coalition against Nazi Germany. Obviously, there's a bias, but this is stated in a NATO paper. In Moscow's opinion, once rejected, the entire world would realize against whom NATO was aimed, and the Soviet Union would have every right to take retaliatory measures. And well, in May 1954, the Western powers did make the decision to turn down the Soviet proposal to join NATO. Their reasoning was that the USSR's membership in the organization would be incompatible with NATO's democratic and defensive aims. And well, then the Cold War followed that. Fast forwarding about 35 years, an old New York Times article I found reports that Russian President Boris Yeltsin had written to NATO saying that Russia hoped to join the alliance sometime in the future. That same NATO paper says that from 1991 to 93, there were quite a lot of talks about Russia's plan to join NATO, and at that time, the intentions of Russian liberals were sincere. While several official partnerships with NATO would be signed by Russia through the 90s, the country mainly took the position of being against any NATO expansion, probably because it felt that its own chances were low. Thus, any NATO expansion into Central and Eastern Europe only caused Russia to feel threatened. And well, expansion happened. It was a process which did exclude Russia, and it was the opinion of the majority of the Russian leaders, especially the military ones, that this process of NATO expansion was aimed against it. Further news about Russia wanting to join NATO wouldn't appear until 2000, when Putin took the presidency. And so moving on to this chapter of history, yes, it looks like President Putin had publicly expressed interest in joining NATO and wanted an invitation. However, according to the former NATO Secretary General, Putin did not want his country to have to go through the usual application process and stand in line with, quote, a lot of countries that don't matter. Then NATO Chief George Robertson went on, saying they wanted to be part of that secure, stable, prosperous West that Russia was out of at the time. But other sources add that Putin's intentions were also under suspicion. That NATO paper, it says that Putin understood the alertness of NATO leaders regarding his past and was giving a number of friendly signals to the West, which were meant to dispel distrust and secure support for his presidential campaign. The Guardian says that the Orange Revolution street protests in Ukraine in 2004 was really what caused Putin to become increasingly suspicious of the West, who he blamed for funding pro-democracy activities. He was further angered by NATO's significant expansion into Central and Eastern Europe in 2004, with the joining of Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Croatia and Albania later followed in 2009. That NATO paper I keep referencing discusses the dilemma of Russia joining NATO in immense detail. If Russia became a member, there was obviously the massive benefit of turning a former adversary into an ally. So were we really that close to achieving world peace? Well, who knows, really, because that same paper also listed a few reasons for why Russia was not yet compatible with the alliance. Here was what it listed. Psychological compatibility was one hurdle. Even with an expediency of the alliance in mind, it will be hard for both sides to make a 100% turn after decades of being enemies, after viewing each other mainly as targets. The matter is not only with the country's leaders, but also the general public mood. The Russian political elite is not ready for such a radical step. It is so used to exploiting the image of an external enemy that was usually presented as NATO for its domestic needs. Losing such a possibility will cause confusion in the ranks of political and military establishment. Joining NATO will mean that everything said about it before, and equally about Russia itself, is exactly the other way around. The paper added that China would not be all that excited about Russian membership in NATO either. It says that Beijing usually frightened Moscow with closer relationship with the West. As written in TRT World, some experts believe that Russia's membership could have been real if the West had taken its membership prospects seriously back in 2000 or the 1990s. It adds that if Russia did join NATO, then the current Russian onslaught on Ukraine could have been prevented. Well, sure, that seems logical, but I think this one paragraph from that NATO paper is the best one to highlight as a reason for why Russia joining NATO just didn't seem like a realistic possibility at the time. The main concern of the West comes from the contention that Russian presence in the alliance may simply destroy it. Chaos and lack of stability in the country, corruption among political elite, including military as well, the penetration of criminal elements into business, all these distinguishing features of contemporary Russia could spread to other members of the alliance. As a result, instead of positively influencing Russia, NATO will be negatively influenced by the new member. That is more than probable if Russia turns more clearly towards an authoritarian rule. Spoiler alert, that's pretty much what happened. It's at this point that I'll clearly state that the history of NATO-Russia relations is far more complex than I presented in this video. Surprise, surprise, history is often complicated like that. Nonetheless, all of this was quite fascinating for me to comb through and learn for myself. And so would Russian membership in NATO have prevented the current conflict in Ukraine? Well, I would argue that would have been a strong possibility. But I would also say that Russia as a NATO member could definitely have created its own problems, resulting in their own set of unexpected consequences. And so, did you know about Russia's previous interest in joining NATO? How do you think history would have played out if this had happened? Do let me know what you think by leaving a comment.